In the past few weeks alone, there have been a number of devastating blows for our railway network, already crippled by state capture, vandalism and neglect. Transnet's freight rail iron ore corridor that runs between the Northern Cape and the Western Cape suffered a derailment and significant cable theft, causing major delays. The Joburg to Durban container corridor has also been the target of extensive theft. Passenger services crippled as well. And while PRASA has been able to reopen some lines, the reality is it doesn't have enough money to fix all the problems. I'm joined now by Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg. He's the director at the Centre for Social Change. Prof, thanks so much for joining us. I mean, there is so much to discuss because there are so many problems. Let's start with ordinary South Africans. The railways used to be the way to get cheap transport, cheap public transport. They mostly don't have that anymore. Most of those passenger services are not yet back up and running. But increasingly, we're seeing cargo that would have gone by train going on the roads, and that's also impacting communities. Just talk to us about how the failure of the railways is impacting ordinary South Africans.
Yes, no, it's great to be with you, Sally. Thanks for having me. And the ordinary person who would have needed to travel, I mean, apartheid migrant labor was the logic of very, very extensive Transnet tracks. And of course, they were shut down in the 90s already as the combis came up and sort of crowded out the rail and was more efficient and direct to local sites. But then, as you say, with the crash, especially of Transnet's freight capacity, the trucks have taken over. And we see these trucks when the line that goes from Lephalale in the north all the way down to Richards Bay to carry coal is being disrupted. It used to do 80 million tons a year. It's 50 million last year. And when trucks take over and they use these sort of small back roads and even the bigger roads in northern KwaZulu-Natal, they race through communities, and now those communities are saying, no, we won't have them there, and they do blockades. So the tensions are rising. The trucks are also characterized by a lot of xenophobia. There's a terrible sort of battle between local drivers and those immigrants, especially who are trying to take goods back and forth to Zimbabwe and Zambia. Lots of big problems at the level, and the policy is correct. Let's go from road to rail, and it's a climate imperative because the trucks also use so much more petrol, and they really do rip up the roads. So there's a lot of, let's say, externalities, costs that are just passed on to us, the society and the environment.
And as I've read through the National Rail Policy, the white paper is talking a lot because, I mean, let's face it, I think Transnet's 120 billion rand and counting in debt at the moment. So they're proposing public-private partnerships, also devolving to municipalities that can actually run PRASA. But if we look at these public-private partnerships, they haven't actually done so well. There was a lack of interest in the one proposal, I think it was last year. Is there enough profit incentive for private companies to get involved?
Well, PRASA being a bit different, and of course the big competition, again, micro transport in the form of combis who don't want to see those rail lines. They're often accused, the combi operators, of being part of the sabotage of the rail and the buses. But I think the critical one is that, as you say, the public-private partnership option for Transnet at the ports, where they should be much more efficient, according to World Bank surveys, about the third least efficient ports in the world, especially Durban, the big one. And right now, not only because the rail line is down, and that's partly the April 20 and May 2022 floods, the rain bombs that tore up Transnet's rails, but a lot of sabotage, a lot of cable theft. So they're only doing about 25% of capacity. And I think the sense that a private sector operator like a Bidvest is the main one, they looked at the ports and they're not really bidding. And when we see private operators run rail like, say, Britain, it's not satisfactory. The Brits will tell you this was a big mistake in policy terms.
Yeah, so what are our options?
Well, one is to deal with the debt. And I would have said when the Public Enterprises Minister with authority here, Pravin Gordhan, last month went to China, he was meant to work out one of the most serious dilemmas. It's the same dilemma that Eskom has with inherited corruption that causes debt. In the case of Eskom, Medupe and Kasile, corrupt coal-fired power plants, and Hitachi bribed the ANC, and the debt by World Bank and many banks remains on our books and our shoulders. For Transnet, it was what Pravin Gordhan was meant to sort out, which was that China South Rail was part of that big 1,000 locomotive purchase. They did several hundred. But then they started cheating on taxes, according to SARS. And so they started not giving spare parts. So we have, I think, about 200 or so of those locomotives sitting idle. And that was what Minister Gordon was meant to sort out. He couldn't do it. I mean, the terrible thing is you want to say to the corrupter, China South Rail, who used Gupta connections to get huge markups, you guys take the hit.
Yeah.
And that would have been logical, but now we're the parts. So it's a very complicated situation. I would have said that it might be better just to default on some of those loans, saying it's odious debt. You take the haircut, you lenders, the China Development Bank in this case.
But then would we be able to get the loans to revive our railways without, if we have a default?
Well, that's the next question. What are the railroads for? And if it's for exporting commodities, certainly the last 2 years have been very, very good because prices are at sky-high levels until last May. And then they started to crash. So coal was about $460 a ton, now down to the 110 level where it's sort of middling. Okay, then the currency declines and these guys are basically using local currency, rand, for their labor and their other expenses. So they're making good profits in the coal companies. But the ability to say to the society, we should put a lot of money into exporting of coal during a climate catastrophe, or manganese or iron ore, the big three heavy freight exports, when the prices are going down. And you really need rail for maybe long-distance commuters and also for importing those necessary goods from the Durban harbor in containers, although we need to do more localization of industry, everyone agrees, but also for PRASA, for local rail, so we can get the metro rails up and running, so that the ability of ordinary people who are disadvantaged by apartheid, living so far away from the city, can be alleviated. And those would be, to me, the central challenges. And doing whatever they do for exporters of coal doesn't impress me.
Let's talk about safety. I mean, you alluded to the fact that certainly in the metro areas, there's sometimes allegations that the taxi business is involved in disrupting the lines because they want the commuters to come to them. But let's put that aside, because what we've seen in recent weeks around the freight lines is some really serious theft and sabotage. Why are we unable to secure those lines? Is it purely because they stretch for thousands of kilometers?
Yes, I don't think Transnet, and certainly PRASA during COVID, they were disastrous on security. But there's another dilemma, and we see it all over municipalities as well, which is public-private pilfering, in which if something is broken, sabotaged, typically there'll be money in the contract to repair it. And that built-in incentive to put profits into what should be state functions as outsourcing goes along hasn't been resolved. Only really in universities like mine did we insource the low-paid workers because the oppression was too much and fees must fall students were in alliance. I think we should be looking more at public-public partnerships and less of this pilfering that incentivizes the sabotage.
Yeah. Talk to me then about a solution. What would a public-public enterprise look like? Because I think, on the one hand, many South Africans are disenchanted with how the state has run things. But I think there's a group of South Africans, me, for example, I don't care if it's publicly or privately owned, as long as it works.
Yeah.
What's the most effective way to ensure that the system is clean? Not in terms of climate, because we know that rail transport is probably one of the better options, but free of corruption. The state can actually ramp everything up. Is that what you're suggesting? Who would give us that money?
Well, one way to do it is to put the proper cost on airplanes, because a Durban flight is only 540 rand if you buy the right one, and then you've got to sort of say, well, what is the damage being done to the environment by jet fuel? And that actually, when even the International Monetary Fund measured our implicit subsidies that go to the consumers of fossil fuels, people like me who fly around a lot. It's enormous. And I think that sort of, say, a carbon tax that would really...
That wouldn't give us enough money, though, to fix the railways. Let's be
some
honest.
of these are very expensive. But if you did a Durban-Joburg, I think you could justify, as they did between Mombasa and Nairobi.
That's taxing the individual, though, for the sins of the state.
Right. But if you subsidize the trip for people to move on these fast trains, Durban to Joburg, you'd easily find a large proportion of people currently on buses and combis and those who fly, who would find it much faster and more convenient and comfortable to go on a fast train. Look, these are visions that President Ramaphosa has expressed in his smart cities. But that's,
it's actually the ideal.
To go beyond rhetoric and explore it. We're going to be in a new society where speed of transport shouldn't be blocked by people stealing cables. So we need to really put much more of a focus, but particularly so that trains, which should be run on a cleaner electricity grid, would then replace the kind of petrol engines and airplanes that we normally go around the country with.
Yeah, I mean, it's that sort of forward-thinking vision when you're stuck in a hole that is very difficult because you're just trying to get the basics up and running again. But maybe it's a time to leapfrog.
The one promise was Siyabonga Gama and Brian Molefe, the two prior Transnet CEOs, are up for prosecution. That does warm my heart that people who were involved in that massive locomotive corruption might have to answer for it.
Yeah, let's hope we see that, because I think South Africans are really fed up, and it's really becoming more and more obvious how much destruction was done, not just the theft of the money, but the fact that money was not used for infrastructure to treat the ailing water sanitation systems in Hammanskraal properly. And we're seeing that again and again. Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening, Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg. He's the director of the Centre for Social Change. Now, still to